Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig, where we will build together a critical understanding of U.S. history through analyzing the processes of change. Now that we have explored all of the essential content of AP U.S. history, it's time for us to do some big picture review. Today, we turn our attention to the theme of economic change throughout the 9 time periods of AP U.S. history. Time period 1 is usually not one of those most important for the APUS course, but to understand economic change in history, it is essential. In my opinion, there are just a few world-changing historical moments in the economic history of this world. The first would be the transition to agriculture and domesticated livestock 10,000 years ago. The second, though, takes place in this period of APUS, the Columbian Exchange. The American crops will completely transform the economies, diets, and cultures of Afro-Eurasia. Furthermore, Europeans were able to plant luxury crops such as sugar, coffee, and tobacco, all produced by enslaved labor in their American colonies, which becomes part of the next major economic shift in this economic history of the world, the exit of European society from feudalism and into what becomes market capitalism. And in case you're keeping track of things at home, the final major economic shift will be the Industrial Revolution, which would not have been possible without Europe breaking with feudalism and creating a capitalist economic base. As the 13 colonies grew, so too did mercantile capitalism. The colonies existed as a producer of raw commodities for their imperial metropole, Britain. From the point of view of the metropole, mercantile capitalism was a form of economic protectionism. The colonies would only trade with the mother country, therefore limiting the need for Britain to have to trade with its rivals, thereby getting to keep its capital in the form of precious minerals in London. The southern colonies' economy was based upon the cultivation of cash crops to be sold to British traders only, although these mercantile policies proved tough to enforce. New England's economy's exports would be centered upon the natural resources it could transform into commodities, namely timber, fish, and blubber. The middle colonies became the breadbasket of the colonies, with agricultural fields devoted to grains and livestock. Time period 3 begins with the French and Indian War, and in economic history, the end of salutary neglect. After the war, in order to get out of the debt Britain accumulated, taxes were placed upon its lightest tax subjects, the colonists, and mercantile policies became more strictly enforced. Slavery had appeared to be on the decline in the colonies, that is, until the appearance of the cotton gin in 1793. With this machine, the cultivation of cotton was now ultra profitable, but more importantly, it led to the massive growth of slavery in the American South and the creation of the Cotton Kingdom. After the Revolutionary era, the ratification of the federal constitution not only created a democratic republic in a sense, it also solidified a capitalist nation-state that would use every power given to its new federal government to protect the institution of private property. In antebellum America, the economy of the new nation further diversified, laying the groundwork for economic sectionalism. Henry Clay's American system was a plan to use the federal government as the accelerant to modern economic development. Through high tariffs, the burgeoning American industries would grow, and funding for road, canal, and railroad construction would be secured. Thus begins the era of the market revolution, or the collision of expanded markets, industrial production, and efficient transportation. In time period 5, America will expand across the continent, which will provide economic riches for generations to come at the expense of the Native Americans and of Mexico. The Civil War ends the institution of slavery, and $4 billion in assets to the racist Southerners now become emancipated people. The Southern economy is destroyed. The Northern industrial economy is victorious. The South, despite attempting to industrialize, will largely remain agrarian, with the system of sharecropping largely replacing the economic institution of slavery. Time period 6 is known as the Gilded Age. Industrialism continues to grow from regional business to national and then to international corporations. This is the era of economic social Darwinism, the all-powerful robber barons, and the laissez-faire capitalist federal government. It is also an era of massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, low-wage labor, to feed the insatiable appetite of the factory mouths. Workers, thanks to a growing class consciousness, begin the long and violent struggle to organize and form labor unions. Industrial and financial capitalism continue to grow in period 7 until the bubble bursts and the system collapses, thus revealing how unstable a capitalist base is by its very definition. The 1920s were an era of innovation, of mass production, and of mass consumption. Henry Ford and Fordism reigned as workers' wages did rise as production became the assembly line system of labor. With higher wages, people had more money to spend, and spend they did. They spent so much that even when they didn't have money, they continued to spend, with credit. But the economy was built on a very shaky foundation, and in 1929 it cracked and the whole house came tumbling down, the Great Depression. Every part of the capitalist machine had broke. A real revolution seemed possible. Along comes FDR and the New Deal. The New Deal would drastically change the role of the federal government. It would be the death blow to conservative laissez-faire capitalism of the 1920s, of the Republican administrations of the 1920s. According to New Deal liberalism, the federal government did have a role to play in the economy. In order to save capitalism, the federal government would need to grant itself massive regulatory powers, as well as the power to spend beyond its means as a way to kickstart the economy into action. And those socialists and communists did help FDR to move to the left in many ways, most notably with the Social Security Act. The New Deal was not an attempt to end capitalism. It was an attempt to save it from its own excesses. New Deal liberalism continued into time period 8, as America became the wealthiest nation in the world thanks to the post-World War II economic boom. The standard of living for Americans went up. People's purchasing power went up. And corporate taxes were very high. This was the era when the American economy worked perhaps the best it possibly could have. It was the era of the Cold War, but in economic terms, this means an era of American economic imperialism, or as Lenin called it, the highest stage of capitalism. Under the terms and conditions of the Cold War, the U.S. used all of its implicit and explicit power to project its economic influence and economic hegemony around the globe, interfering in nations that dared to challenge the U.S.-led economic order in any way. The new post-war economic glow began to fade in the 1970s with a major recession, inflation of prices, but a stagnation of wages we call stagflation. Time period 9 is very key when looking at from our lens of economic change. The election of Reagan in 1980 marked the death of New Deal economic liberalism and the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as an economic project consisted of attacking labor unions, privatizing as many public assets as possible, cutting taxes, slashing public spending, thus suffocating social services by design. It has set the stage for the nation we now live in, and worst of all, it taught us to just accept it. Colleges were once tuition free. Now that seems unbelievable. The US was close to universal health care. Now that seems a dream. The cost of living goes up every year, but wages do not. CEOs of companies once made 8 to 10 times the salary of their average employee. In the last 40 years, CEOs have seen a 1,000% pay growth and now make over 300 times what their average worker makes. Now for some final thoughts on economic change in our nation's history. Let's never forget that the economy of the U.S. was built upon the backs of enslaved black workers. The market revolution of the early 19th century was as important to U.S. history as the Industrial Revolution was to Europe. The victory of the industrial North over the agrarian South in the Civil War opened the way for the industrial project to create the Gilded Age. And finally, periods of laissez-faire capitalism have led to catastrophe. Catastrophe leads to brief eras of economic reform. Periods of economic reform require federal government intervention. Conservative forces fight against government regulation and make people believe that government is their enemy and that corporations act in the best interests of the people. The cycle then begins again. Well, that was fun. See you next time on the APUSH Dig.